In the second week of December, something strange begins to happen in the Twin Flame Collective, something subtle, powerful, and impossible to ignore. The Divine Feminine, who once held her heart wide open for the masculine, suddenly feels a shift, a quiet resistance, a rising discomfort that she cannot explain. It's as if a veil lifts overnight, revealing truths she was never meant to overlook. She wakes up not with longing, but with clarity, not with hunger, but with discernment. And for the first time, the masculine energy she once defended, adored, and waited for, begins to irritate her, trigger her, disappoint her in ways that feel ancient and overdue. At first, she thinks something is wrong. But what if this shift isn't a collapse, but an awakening? What if the sudden dislike is not rejection, but realignment? What if December marks the unraveling of illusions so the soul can finally see what the heart has been avoiding? This is the moment the journey flips. This is the moment destiny sharpens its edge. This is the moment she stops chasing, and he starts feeling. Because when the Divine Feminine pulls back, the entire connection reorganizes itself. And nothing, not even the masculine, can remain the same. Welcome to the stage where love stops being a dream and starts becoming truth. The dissolution of emotional conditioning is one of the most profound spiritual turning points in the Divine Feminine's awakening. It is the moment she realizes that much of what she once called love was never love at all, but conditioning, ancestral, societal, and emotional patterns that taught her to tolerate instability, silence, inconsistency, and pain in the name of devotion. For lifetimes, she associated emotional chaos with connection and intensity with intimacy. She believed that the depth of her suffering was equal to the depth of her love. But now, a deeper truth emerges. She begins to see that the bond she felt was not always soul recognition but sometimes trauma attachment, formed through wounds that mirrored each other rather than souls that were truly aligned. This realization is not easy. It unravels everything she once held sacred. Yet it is the beginning of her liberation. In this awakening, the feminine starts to separate what her heart felt from what her conditioning taught her to accept. She notices the patterns that kept her trapped in cycles of longing, waiting, and proving herself. She begins to understand that she does not need to earn love through patience, sacrifice, or emotional endurance. She sees that the universe never asked her to shrink herself, silence her needs, or confuse inconsistency with destiny. What she thought was devotion was often self-abandonment dressed in spiritual language. She awakens to the truth that healthy love is not fueled by emotional tension or constant uncertainty. It is built on presence, reciprocity, and safety. And with that clarity, the old patterns she once clung to start to lose their power. As her consciousness expands, she stops equating emotional highs with spiritual connection. She no longer interprets the adrenaline of the chase or the anxiety of the unknown as signs of something meaningful. Instead, she recognizes that these sensations were rooted in unhealed wounds, abandonment fears, unmet childhood needs, generational beliefs that told her suffering made her worthy. She sees where she confused karmic lessons with divine union, where she allowed pain to masquerade as purpose. The veil lifts, and she begins to reclaim her emotional understanding with a clarity she has never known before. With this new awareness, she steps into a different internal identity, one that refuses to apologize for needing honesty, consistency, respect, and emotional presence. She no longer sees her needs as burdens. She no longer feels guilty for wanting reciprocation. She no longer diminishes her intuition to maintain a connection that drains her. Instead, she honors herself as a spiritual being whose emotions are sacred indicators of alignment. She becomes a woman who validates her own truth rather than waiting for another to validate it for her. This dissolution is not the end of love, it is the end of distortion. It is the moment she stops mistaking emotional instability for divine purpose. It is where she chooses herself for the first time without hesitation. And from that empowered place, she begins to attract love that reflects her healing, not her wounds. There comes a sacred moment in the Divine Feminine's awakening when she finally returns to her inner authority, a power she unknowingly surrendered throughout her spiritual journey. For so long, she looked outward for reassurance, towards signs, synchronicities, readings, timelines, and the shifting energy of the masculine. She used these external cues as anchors, believing they held the answers she needed. But slowly, almost silently, she begins to realize that she had given away a power that was never meant to leave her hands. Her spiritual path was never meant to be navigated by messages outside of herself, but by the wisdom that lived within her soul from the beginning. And so, the reclamation begins, not with force, but with clarity. In this awakening, she stops depending on signs to confirm the truth her heart already whispers. She no longer needs angel numbers or cosmic nudges to validate her intuition. The synchronicities that once felt like lifelines now become gentle reminders rather than guiding mandates. She realizes that the universe uses signs to support her, not to override her sovereignty. Her connection to spirit becomes internal rather than external, rooted not in seeking but in knowing. The divine feminine learns to trust the voice within her chest more than the symbols outside of her. This shift marks her rise into spiritual maturity, where intuition becomes her compass, not her question. Her inner authority begins to outweigh her longing. The desire for union no longer blinds her to her deeper truth. She sees that longing, while natural, cannot override self-respect, emotional balance, or alignment. She no longer bends her boundaries to fit a spiritual narrative. She stops waiting for him to validate the connection, the purpose, or the timing. She realizes that her soul does not need permission to know what it knows. The certainty within her becomes louder than the uncertainty around her. This is the moment she finally trusts herself more than she trusts the journey. And with that trust, she stops waiting for him to awaken, waiting for him to choose her, waiting for divine timing to justify her stagnation. She understands that waiting is not devotion. Waiting is disempowerment if it is rooted in fear of moving forward. So instead of standing still for love, she moves toward her destiny. She chooses creation over stagnation, expansion over expectation. She chooses to walk the path in front of her rather than pausing for someone walking in circles behind her. She realizes that her journey is her own, and she has every right to evolve, rise, and step ahead no matter where the masculine currently stands. As she reclaims her inner authority, she returns to the throne of her own life. She becomes the leader of her destiny, the architect of her timeline, the sovereign of her soul's path. She begins to walk with a confidence that does not come from certainty about the masculine, but from certainty about herself. She stops asking, "Is this the right time? Is he ready?" and begins affirming, "I am ready." And that is enough. This return to inner authority is not a rejection of love, it is the elevation of it. When the feminine stands in her sovereignty, she becomes magnetic. She becomes aligned. She becomes the embodiment of her highest self. And from that place, the universe bends to meet her, not the other way around. There is a powerful spiritual milestone in the divine feminine's awakening, the neutralization of emotional triggers. It is the moment when the masculine's behavior, which once had the power to unravel her, suddenly loses its intensity. What once destabilized her no longer penetrates her field. What once caused anxiety now brings understanding. This shift is not coldness, it is consciousness. It is the moment her energy becomes so aligned that nothing outside of her can pull her away from her center. She realizes that she was never meant to live in emotional volatility, constantly reacting to someone else's fear, silence, or avoidance. Instead, she discovers the profound strength of neutrality, the stillness of a soul finally in sovereignty. Where silence once sent her spiraling into stories, doubts, and fears of abandonment, it now creates clarity. She no longer interprets distance as rejection or assumes she must fix something within herself to be chosen. Silence becomes information. Distance becomes revelation. Instead of taking it personally, she sees it as the masculine's own internal battle, something that has nothing to do with her worth or her lovability. She understands that emotional withdrawal is not a commentary on her value but a mirror of his unresolved fears. This understanding allows her to step out of chaos and into truth. The same mixed signals that once kept her emotionally entangled now illuminate misalignment with piercing clarity. Where she once interpreted inconsistency as something mysterious or spiritually significant, she now recognizes it as emotional unavailability. Where she once saw potential, she now sees patterns. Where she once romanticized his hesitation, she now sees it as a boundary she cannot cross for him. This clarity is not born from bitterness, it is born from awakening. Her intuition, once clouded by longing, now becomes sharp, grounded, and sovereign. Her nervous system begins to recalibrate. The old fight-or-flight responses, the ones created by repeated cycles of abandonment, fear, chasing, waiting, or trying to anticipate his next move, begin to dissolve. She no longer rides emotional roller coasters. She no longer experiences surges of anxiety at every pause, delay, or shift in his energy. Her body, once wired for survival within the connection, now becomes wired for peace. Emotional neutrality takes the place of emotional chaos. She no longer seeks intensity to feel connection, she seeks alignment. This neutrality does not mean she has shut down her heart. In fact, her heart becomes more open, more stable, more attuned to truth than ever before. She can still feel love, but it is no longer entangled with fear. She can still feel connection, but it is no longer laced with anxiety. Emotional triggers lose their power because she no longer abandons herself in response to them. Through this spiritual transformation, she steps into a new emotional landscape, one where she is no longer controlled by external behavior but guided by internal knowing. The divine feminine becomes untouchable not because she is hardened, but because she is healed. She no longer reacts from wounds, she responds from wisdom. And in that neutrality, the connection itself transforms. The masculine is no longer met with reactivity, but with a steady truth that challenges him to rise. There is a sacred turning point on the divine feminine's spiritual journey where she begins reclaiming her heart, not the heart shaped by wounds, expectations, or conditioning, but the original, untouched essence of her soul. This reclamation is not loud or dramatic, it is subtle, graceful, and deeply transformative. It begins when she realizes that the love she gave so freely for so long was never meant to be self-sacrificing. For years, she believed that love meant bending, adjusting, overgiving, and enduring. She thought devotion meant holding space even when she was empty, being understanding even when she was hurting, and being patient even when her spirit was exhausted. But now she awakens to a higher truth: real love must be self-honoring, or it is not love at all. As her consciousness expands, she learns that devotion must never exclude devotion to herself. She understands that giving from a depleted heart is not sacred, it is self-abandonment wearing a spiritual mask. She recognizes that the love she offers another must be equal in depth to the love she offers her own soul. This does not make her selfish, it makes her sovereign. Her energy no longer pours endlessly into places that do not nourish her. Instead, it circulates through her, rising from a source of fullness rather than desperation. This shift becomes a spiritual homecoming, where she finally meets herself with the same tenderness she once reserved only for others. Through this awakening, she deepens her understanding of vulnerability. She once believed vulnerability meant exposure without protection, giving without limits, trusting without boundaries. But now she learns that true vulnerability is sacred and should be met, not exploited. It is not something to be handed to someone who has not demonstrated emotional safety. Her soul begins to reject situations where her openness is used against her or where her softness becomes an invitation for imbalance. She understands that vulnerability without reciprocity is not intimacy, it is harm. And so, she begins protecting the parts of herself that were once freely given away. As the feminine heart reclaims its sacredness, it expands, but this expansion is guided by discernment, boundaries, and spiritual maturity. Her boundaries are not walls, they are expressions of self-love. They exist not to keep love out, but to ensure that only love capable of honoring her purity can enter. She becomes exquisitely aware of the energy she allows into her space. She is no longer impressed by intensity, promises, or potential. She seeks alignment, consistency, and truth. Her heart opens wider than ever, but only to what matches the frequency of her growth. In this stage, something profound happens. she becomes incapable of loving in ways that diminish her. The patterns where she shrank, twisted herself, or dimmed her light simply fall away. They no longer feel natural, and her spirit refuses to participate in them. She cannot return to versions of love that require her silence, her suffering, or her sacrifice. Her soul rises too high for her to descend into the old ways of giving. Reclaiming her heart does not make her colder, it makes her clearer. It does not make her less loving, it makes her love divinely, consciously, and truthfully. She becomes the embodiment of sacred feminine love, love that honors her, nourishes her, and elevates the world around her without ever asking her to diminish herself again. There comes a moment in the divine feminine's awakening when the veil of spiritual romanticization finally lifts. It is a profound, sobering, and liberating shift in consciousness. For so long, she used the idea of spiritual purpose to explain behaviors that were never spiritual at all: silence, avoidance, inconsistency, emotional immaturity. She wrapped neglect in divine meaning because she believed the connection was destined, and therefore every wound must have been sacred. But as she evolves, she begins to see the difference between true spiritual guidance and the stories she created to protect her heart from disappointment. The divine feminine no longer hides behind cosmic narratives to excuse what her intuition has been warning her about. She realizes that love does not require her to suffer in the name of purpose. She stops labeling dysfunction as a divine test. She stops telling herself that emotional absence is a lesson she is meant to endure, or that his running is part of a sacred blueprint she must tolerate with unconditional patience. She begins to understand that the universe does not test her through repeated cycles of pain, her unhealed wounds do. She recognizes that patterns repeating themselves are not spiritual trials but invitations to awaken. The divine does not ask her to learn through suffering, it asks her to learn through awareness. And awareness reveals that not every difficulty is destiny, and not every connection is meant to be carried to the finish line in its current form. The feminine also stops glamorizing the pain. She no longer sees her tears as offerings to the universe or her heartbreak as a necessary sacrifice for union. She no longer believes that enduring emotional imbalance somehow proves the depth of her soul or the strength of her connection. Pain stops being poetic and becomes what it truly is: misalignment. She realizes that sacred love does not demand that she collapse, wait endlessly, or hold on to someone who refuses to meet her energetically. She begins to see that real spiritual growth does not come from tolerating wounds, but from healing them. At this stage, she makes a crucial distinction between spiritual connection and spiritual bypassing. She understands that a soul bond is real, but the behaviors layered on top of it are human. She sees where she used spirituality to avoid facing the truth. She sees where she used destiny to avoid accountability. She sees where she used potential to avoid acknowledging patterns. This clarity breaks the spell. She no longer uses spirituality as a shield that keeps her trapped in cycles that drain her. With this awakening, destiny transforms. It no longer feels like suffering she must endure or lessons she must endlessly revisit. It becomes a path of alignment, clear, grounded, and sovereign. Destiny becomes the journey of choosing what honors her soul rather than what wounds it. She realizes that true divine love elevates her, not exhausts her. It expands her, not diminishes her. It empowers her consciousness, not destabilizes her heart. The end of spiritual romanticization is not the end of her faith, it is the purification of it. It is the moment she chooses truth over fantasy, alignment over attachment, and healing over illusion. This shift opens the door to a higher form of love, one built not on suffering but on resonance, mutual growth, and divine reciprocity. There is a sacred moment in the divine feminine's awakening when she steps into emotional sobriety, a profound state where her heart finally detaches from the highs, lows, illusions, and fantasies that once ruled her inner world. For so long, the connection felt intoxicating. The intensity, the longing, the signs, the mystical pull, everything created an emotional cocktail that felt spiritual yet left her ungrounded. She mistook adrenaline for intuition, yearning for connection, and energetic surges for divine confirmation. But now, she becomes sober. The emotional fog begins to lift, and what once felt like magic now reveals itself as a mixture of hope, projection, and unhealed desire. This is not a loss of love, it is the restoration of clarity. As she enters this sobriety, love stops being addictive. It no longer comes wrapped in extremes or fueled by uncertainty. The roller coaster that once defined the bond loses its appeal. She no longer feels drawn to the drama of waiting, wondering, or trying to interpret mixed signals. Her heart begins to crave balance instead of intensity, consistency instead of confusion, presence instead of potential. She realizes that true spiritual love is not chaotic. It is conscious, steady, grounded, and aligned. She no longer feels compelled to chase the emotional spikes that once gave her a sense of meaning. Emotional clarity replaces emotional intoxication. She starts to see the connection without filters for the first time, not through the lens of longing, not through the lens of fear, not through the lens of hope, but through the lens of truth. She sees who he is now, not who she imagines he could become. She sees the difference between soul recognition and emotional dependency. She sees her own patterns, her own projections, her own wounds that once made the bond feel larger than life. And instead of running from these truths, she embraces them, because clarity brings liberation. In this clarity, she recognizes that her emotions were often amplified by the unknown, the inconsistency, the unresolved tension between them. She now understands that this is not divine union, it is an invitation to heal. She stops romanticizing intensity as depth. She stops interpreting confusion as spiritual mystery. She stops believing that emotional volatility is proof of destiny. Instead, she begins valuing emotional regulation, peace, and inner alignment. She becomes the observer of her emotions rather than being consumed by them. This clarity empowers her in ways she never imagined. It gives her a strength that no romantic feeling could ever provide. She no longer feels controlled by longing. She no longer loses herself in fantasies about the future. She no longer abandons her present self for a potential timeline. Instead, she stands rooted in her power, grounded, aware, and sovereign. Emotional sobriety returns her to herself. The connection doesn't lose its spiritual significance. It simply loses the distortion that made it overwhelming. She can finally discern what is real, what is projection, and what is simply unhealed desire seeking resolution. This shift becomes one of the greatest gifts of her awakening. It frees her from emotional intoxication and brings her into a state of conscious, aligned, and sovereign love. There comes a profound and humbling stage in the divine feminine's spiritual awakening where she finally releases the role of the emotional healer, an identity she did not consciously choose, but one she inhabited for lifetimes. Throughout her journey, she believed that love required her to fix, soothe, nurture, and guide the masculine through every emotional shadow he refused to face. She carried his wounds as if they were sacred responsibilities, believing that her compassion could heal what he was unwilling or unready to confront. But as her consciousness expands, she recognizes the deep spiritual truth: she is not responsible for healing him. She cannot rescue a soul that must first choose to rescue itself. This realization does not come from anger but from awakening. She begins to see the patterns clearly, how often she stepped into roles that were never meant for her. She played the teacher when he lacked awareness. She played the therapist when he struggled to express his emotions. She played the mother when he avoided accountability. She played the savior when he ran from his own reflection. Every time he withdrew, she leaned in. Every time he shut down, she opened further. Every time he resisted growth, she expanded for both of them. But now she sees that none of these roles belong to her. Love is not meant to be a spiritual rehabilitation center, and union is not built through one soul carrying the emotional weight of another. Releasing this role becomes an act of deep spiritual liberation. She stops accepting the burden of driving the emotional growth for both. She recognizes how exhausting it was to walk for him, feel for him, understand for him, and heal for him. She sees how often she mistook emotional labor for love, and how often she believed that if she just held on long enough, he would eventually rise. But true healing cannot be done on someone else's behalf. The sacred feminine learns that every soul must meet its own shadows, take responsibility for its own journey, and choose its own evolution. Through this awakening, she understands that genuine union requires two healed individuals, not one carrying the other across the threshold of transformation. A relationship cannot ascend if only one is doing the spiritual work. A connection cannot stabilize if one partner is emotionally regulated while the other repeatedly collapses into old patterns. She realizes that what she once saw as unconditional love was often unconditional overgiving, draining her energy and denying him the opportunity to rise through his own choices. And so, she finally gives back what was never hers to carry. She places his wounds, fears, responsibilities, and unhealed emotions back into his hands, not to punish him, but to free both of them. She stops being his emotional anchor and becomes her own. She stops filling the silence with solutions and lets the silence teach him. She stops absorbing his pain and lets him feel the consequences of avoiding his healing. In this surrender, she does not walk away from love, she walks away from imbalance. Releasing the role of healer is not abandonment, it is alignment. It is the divine feminine stepping into her rightful place, a partner, not a parent, a woman, not a healer, a soul deserving of reciprocity, not responsibility. And in giving back what was never hers, she finally creates space for a union built on equality, consciousness, and true spiritual maturity. There is a sacred turning point in the divine feminine's journey where she stops leaking her power outward and begins reclaiming the natural magnetism that has always lived within her. This is the moment she shifts from chasing to attracting, not as a strategy, but as a consequence of her inner evolution. For so long, she believed she had to prove her worth, demonstrate her devotion, or energetically reach toward the masculine to maintain the connection. But now, something profound unfolds within her. She realizes that her true power was never in pursuit, but in presence. She understands that the feminine does not chase, she draws, she invites, she magnetizes. This realization rewires her spiritually, emotionally, and energetically. As she returns to her magnetism, she becomes effortless, radiant, and inwardly focused. She no longer looks outward for validation or assurance. She no longer overgives, overexplains, or overfunctions just to keep the connection alive. Instead, she pours her energy back into herself. She reconnects with her creativity, her intuition, her passions, her rituals, and her inner peace. The more she turns inward, the more luminous her presence becomes. She begins to glow with the kind of authenticity that cannot be forced. Her aura shifts, her energy softens, and her soul expands. She becomes irresistible not because she tries, but because she stops trying. As she rises into this new frequency, the masculine feels it instantly. Her elevated vibration naturally polarizes him into action because her energy is no longer entangled with fear, longing, or expectation. She is no longer pulling on him, pushing energy toward him, or trying to fill the gaps he refuses to acknowledge. Instead, she stands in her own essence, a place of inner certainty and emotional steadiness. This shift activates a spiritual polarity that had been imbalanced for so long. When the feminine stands still in her truth, the masculine must move. When she stops overreaching, he begins reaching. When she stops pursuing, he feels the pull of her absence. Her magnetism becomes the catalyst for his awakening, not through pressure, but through energetic truth. Reclaiming her magnetism means she no longer convinces or compensates. She does not try to persuade him of the connection, interpret signs for him, or hold the emotional weight of both. She does not shrink herself to make him comfortable, nor does she elevate him at the expense of her own worth. She stops trying to fit into the version of love she once believed she needed to earn. Now she simply allows. She allows herself to be chosen. She allows love to flow toward her without force. She allows the universe to align what is meant for her without manipulation or fear. Allowing becomes her new form of power. Her magnetism deepens because she no longer moves out of alignment. She chooses peace over panic, presence over pursuit, self-respect over self-abandonment. She holds herself to the frequency of her healed self, not the wounds of her past. and from this steady inner place she becomes a beacon, calling in experiences, opportunities, and relationships that match the woman she has become. The feminine's return to magnetism is the reclamation of her divine essence. It is the moment she remembers that the universe moves through her, not because she demands it, but because she aligns with it. In this alignment, she becomes unshakable, irresistible, and profoundly empowered. There comes a deeply transformative moment in the divine feminine's awakening when she finally releases the energetic codependency that once bound her to the masculine in ways that felt overwhelming, consuming, and spiritually confusing. For so long, she used the connection as a source of emotional identity, a place where she sought validation, meaning, grounding, or purpose. The intensity of the bond made her believe that her emotional stability depended on his presence, his acknowledgement, his attention, or his movement toward her. But as she evolves, she begins to see the truth. No connection, not even a sacred one, is meant to become the center of her self-worth. The divine feminine learns that her identity must come from within, not from the shifting energy of another soul. This awakening shifts something profound inside her. She no longer needs his responses, messages, or engagement to feel complete. She realizes that while his presence once soothed her fears and softened her insecurities, those feelings were never meant to be filled by another human being. They were signals calling her back to her own heart. She begins to understand that her wholeness cannot depend on whether he speaks or withdraws, chooses or hesitates, comes forward or pulls back. She learns to detach her emotional stability from his emotional availability. And in this detachment, she reclaims the pieces of herself she once gave away. As she rises into this new consciousness, the energetic cycles that once hooked her begin to dissolve. The runner-chaser dynamic, the push-pull intensity, the longing, the anxiety, the emotional highs and lows, they lose their grip on her. She sees how much of that cycle was fueled by old wounds, by fear of abandonment, by unhealed patterns that kept her locked in emotional repetition. But now, her awareness breaks the spell. What once triggered her now teaches her. What once destabilized her now reveals truth. She no longer interprets his energy as a reflection of her worth. She no longer internalizes his absence as rejection. She no longer confuses emotional tension with spiritual destiny. Through this emotional liberation, she learns to stand whole within herself. This is perhaps the most powerful stage of her evolution. She finds the parts of herself she once outsourced to him: validation, reassurance, closeness, belonging. She begins to cultivate these qualities within her own soul. She reconnects with her intuition, her creativity, her inner peace, and her spiritual strength. She rediscovers her own presence, the presence that was overshadowed by the intensity of the connection. She starts to feel grounded in her own energy, stable in her own truth, and confident in her own emotional sovereignty. And as she becomes whole, the connection itself transforms. It no longer feels like a lifeline she must cling to in order to feel emotionally alive. It becomes a complement, a soul bond that enriches her life but does not define it. Love becomes expansive instead of restrictive, liberating instead of consuming, harmonious instead of chaotic. The bond remains, but the dependency dissolves. She can now hold the connection without losing herself in it. The rejection of energetic codependency is not the rejection of love, it is the purification of it. In standing whole, she becomes capable of receiving a higher, more conscious form of union, one built not on fear or longing but on alignment, balance, and mutual sovereignty. There is a sacred shift in the divine feminine's awakening when her higher self finally steps forward to lead the journey. Until now, much of her path was driven by her wounded heart, by longing, fear, hope, attachment, and the belief that love required enduring pain or waiting endlessly for the masculine to rise. But as her consciousness evolves, she begins to feel a different voice within her, one that is steady, clear, and deeply rooted in truth. This is the voice of her higher self, the part of her that has always known the way, even when she was lost in illusion. As this voice becomes louder than her wounds, her entire journey transforms. Her higher self begins guiding her choices, revealing what her heart once refused to see. She stops negotiating with her intuition just to remain in situations that keep her small. She no longer silences her inner knowing to maintain emotional comfort or spiritual fantasy. She recognizes the subtle ways she compromised herself, accepting breadcrumbs, tolerating inconsistency, rationalizing emotional absence, and she understands these behaviors were not love, but fear masquerading as devotion. With this awakening, she no longer chooses from her wounds, she chooses from her wisdom. Her inner compass strengthens, and she follows it without hesitation. As her higher self becomes her guide, she begins seeing the connection with a clarity that was previously impossible. She realizes that union, true, sacred, spiritual union, is not something achieved by sacrificing her power or lowering her frequency to meet the masculine in his struggle. Union can only happen when she stands fully in her authenticity, radiance, boundaries, and truth. She understands that the universe never asked her to abandon herself to activate the connection. Instead, the connection was always meant to rise to meet her highest vibration. She sees now that love is not found through chasing potential, but through aligning with the highest version of herself, the version who feels whole, worthy, and sovereign. In this alignment, something profound happens. She stops chasing timelines, outcomes, and external confirmation. She trusts that what is aligned will remain, and what is not aligned will naturally fall away. The obsessive thinking dissolves. The anxiety fades. The emotional roller coaster becomes still. She knows that when she is aligned with her higher self, she cannot lose what is meant for her, nor can she hold on to what the universe is asking her to release. She walks with a confidence rooted not in the masculine's behavior, but in her own spiritual truth. As she rises, the masculine faces a choice he can no longer postpone. Her higher frequency becomes a mirror, illuminating where he has resisted growth, avoided truth, or remained trapped in fear. He must now align with the higher version of himself, accountable, conscious, emotionally present, or he will naturally fall away from her path. This isn't punishment, it is spiritual law. Two souls can only unite where their vibrations resonate. This stage marks the divine feminine's return to her power. She no longer waits for the masculine to awaken before she steps into her destiny. She moves forward, guided by her higher self, grounded in truth, and anchored in purpose. And in doing so, she becomes the embodiment of the love she once sought outside herself. There is a profound moment in the divine feminine's spiritual evolution when she shifts from emotion to embodiment. This transformation is subtle yet unmistakably powerful. For so long, she expressed her needs through feelings, words, and emotional vulnerability. She explained her boundaries, articulated her worth, and tried to communicate what she deserved. But now, she no longer needs to say these things, she embodies them. Her energy speaks louder than her voice ever could. Her alignment becomes her declaration. Her presence becomes her truth. This is the stage where she stops trying to be understood and simply becomes undeniable. In this embodied state, she no longer expresses boundaries, she is the boundary. Her energy is so rooted, so clear, so sovereign that anything misaligned with her naturally falls away. She no longer negotiates with disrespect, entertains inconsistency, or accepts emotional half-efforts. She does not need to explain why she will not tolerate certain behaviors. Her frequency rejects them automatically. Her boundaries are not walls but energetic truths, expressed through self-respect, emotional steadiness, and the unapologetic honoring of her inner world. She no longer talks about what she deserves, she lives it. She moves through life in a way that reflects her worth. She chooses relationships, environments, and experiences that match her vibration. She does not chase or convince. She simply exists in a standard of self-love so high that anything lower cannot remain in her field. She stops waiting for the masculine to meet her expectations and begins meeting her own. This shift is not intellectual, it is spiritual. She becomes the embodiment of the woman she once aspired to be. Embodiment becomes her new language, and the masculine can feel it instantly. He senses the change not through her words but through the energetic silence between them. Her presence no longer reaches toward him, it stands tall within itself. Her frequency no longer leans into the connection, it expands around her own life. This creates a magnetic pull that is impossible for the masculine to ignore. Her embodiment reflects his lack of embodiment. Her elevation reveals where he has remained stagnant. Her strength illuminates where he has held on to fear. And in this energetic contrast, he is either compelled to rise or forced to retreat. She stops proving her value and becomes the proof. She no longer overfunctions to be chosen, overexplains to be understood, or overgives to be seen. She no longer performs for love. Instead, she holds herself with the quiet confidence of a woman who knows that her worth is inherent, not earned. She understands that the right masculine energy will recognize her value without persuasion. Her self-possession becomes her validation. Her presence becomes her power. It is the grounded, radiant, peaceful presence of a woman fully embodied in her truth. She becomes a force, not through effort, but through authenticity. She no longer wavers, doubts, or dims her light. She stands in alignment with her highest self, and in doing so, she calls forward a love that matches her evolution. The feminine's shift from emotion to embodiment is the final step into sovereignty. It is the moment she becomes the living expression of everything she once prayed for. There is a powerful and often painful stage in the divine feminine's awakening when the fantasy dies, and with it, the illusion she once mistook for love. This death is not the end of her heart, it is the beginning of its clarity. For so long, she loved the masculine not only for who he was but for who he could be. She held a vision of his highest potential, the version of him his soul whispered to hers in brief moments of vulnerability, synchronicity, and connection. But as she grows spiritually, she begins to realize that loving someone's potential is not the same as loving their reality. She stops evaluating him through the lens of future possibility, and starts seeing him through the mirror of present truth. And in that truth, something profound shifts. Her heart becomes grounded rather than suspended in hope. The romanticized narratives she once created begin to lose their power. She no longer tells herself that his silence is meaningful, that his inconsistency is spiritual, or that his hesitation is destiny. The stories she once built to protect her heart from disappointment now crumble under the weight of honesty. She sees how much of her suffering came from holding on to a version of him that never fully existed in the physical world. What she loved was real in spirit, but incomplete in action. And the feminine now understands that love cannot thrive inside a story, it must live in the present moment, in truth and embodiment. The future fantasies she clung to collapse under the weight of present truth. She no longer projects ahead to a someday version of the connection where everything aligns effortlessly. She no longer uses spiritual ideals to justify emotional absence. She realizes that imagining a future with him was easier than accepting the reality of who he chooses to be now. This realization is not judgment, it is awakening. Her consciousness rises to a point where she can no longer escape into what might be. She is fully rooted in what is. With this clarity, she sees that love must be grounded in action, not imagination. Words, potential, energy, and spiritual chemistry are no longer enough to sustain her. She needs presence. She needs capacity. She needs consistency. She needs a masculine who meets her in reality, not just in the ether. She understands that real love shows up. Real love communicates. Real love grows. Real love chooses. And if he is not choosing in the present, she can no longer keep choosing for both. The death of the fantasy is not the death of love, it is the purification of it. As the illusion dissolves, space opens for something truer, deeper, and more aligned. She begins to love herself more deeply than the story she built around him. She stops trying to extract emotional nourishment from potential and starts seeking nourishment from truth. The fantasy dies so real love can be born, love that is grounded, reciprocal, embodied, and divine. And in that moment she steps into a new chapter of her spiritual journey, one where love expands her rather than diminishes her, uplifts her rather than confuses her, and aligns with her highest self rather than her deepest wounds. There is a deeply sacred moment in the divine feminine's spiritual evolution when she undergoes an emotional rebirth, a transformation so profound that she becomes a new being, one who feels, perceives, and responds to love in an entirely different way. This rebirth is not sudden, it is the culmination of every heartbreak, every awakening, every moment she chose truth over attachment. It is the moment her emotional body restructures itself from the inside out. The wounds that once shaped her reactions begin to heal. The patterns that once dictated her choices begin to dissolve. The fears that once governed her heart lose their power. She awakens into a new emotional frequency, one rooted not in survival, longing, or fear, but in clarity, balance, and self-respect. In this rebirth, she becomes resilient without becoming guarded. Her strength no longer comes from walls or emotional distance. Instead, it comes from inner stability, an unwavering trust in herself and her intuition. She no longer fears abandonment because she no longer abandons herself. She no longer fears rejection because she no longer rejects her own needs. She becomes emotionally grounded, able to withstand uncertainty without collapsing into panic or fantasy. Her resilience is soft, not rigid, flowing from a place of wisdom rather than defense. She also becomes receptive without being naive. Her heart opens, but not recklessly. She listens, but does not absorb. She loves, but does not lose discernment. She welcomes emotional connection, but she no longer confuses kindness with compatibility or intensity with intimacy. She recognizes red flags without spiritualizing them. She sees potential without projecting onto it. Her openness is intentional, not impulsive. She learns to let love in without sacrificing her intuition at the door. This receptivity is a sign of maturity, an emotional intelligence earned through experience and spiritual awakening. Through her rebirth, she becomes loving without losing herself. Her compassion no longer comes from a place of overgiving or emotional hunger. Her devotion no longer demands self-sacrifice. She learns to love with healthy boundaries, with emotional balance, and with a deep awareness of her own value. She no longer pours into others to feel needed or worthy. She pours from overflow, not depletion. She loves with consciousness, with presence, and with sacred intention. Her love becomes a blessing, not a burden. It becomes expansive rather than consuming. It becomes a reflection of her healed heart. This emotional rebirth creates the version of her who is truly meant for union, not the wounded version who chased, clung, or compromised, but the sovereign version who embodies clarity, balance, and self-honor. This new version of her can hold divine love without collapsing under its intensity. She can receive a conscious masculine without losing herself in the connection. She can walk beside him as an equal, not as a healer or sacrificer. She becomes the feminine energy that attracts union effortlessly, not because she demands it, but because she aligns with it. Her emotional rebirth is not the end of her journey, it is the beginning of her true love story, the one written from her highest self, not her deepest wounds. There is a pivotal moment in the twin flame journey when the divine masculine is finally forced to face the emotional mirror he has avoided for so long. This mirror does not appear through conflict, pressure, or ultimatum, it appears through the feminine's evolution. As she rises into her power, her clarity, and her self-respect, she naturally reflects back to him everything he has refused to see within himself. Her transformation is not an attack, it is illumination. And for the masculine, this illumination becomes impossible to escape. The very energy that once comforted him now challenges him to confront the emotional gaps he has ignored, his inconsistency, his lack of effort, his emotional immaturity, and his avoidance patterns. He begins to see clearly what he once hid from himself. Her evolution forces him into a kind of spiritual awakening he did not choose consciously but can no longer avoid. When she stops chasing, he feels the void where her devotion once cushioned his fears. When she stops overgiving, he notices the emptiness caused by his own emotional withholding. When she becomes consistent within herself, he becomes aware of how inconsistent he has been with her. Her growth exposes his stagnation, and suddenly, he can no longer deny the truth of his own behavior. He begins seeing his inconsistency, in how he moved toward her one moment and pulled away the next. He realizes that what he called confusion was often avoidance. What he labeled timing was fear masked as spiritual logic. As her energy becomes stable and self-contained, he sees how erratic his was in contrast. The inconsistency he once justified now feels painful to face because, through her clarity, he sees the emotional instability he created. He begins seeing his lack of effort, not as an accident, but as a pattern. Her new embodied standards highlight how little he contributed emotionally. Her alignment shows him how much she carried. Her self-respect reveals how much he depended on her forgiveness. Where he once believed he was trying, he now sees the places where he offered potential instead of presence, promises instead of action. Her evolution makes his minimal effort undeniable. He begins seeing his emotional immaturity. The defensiveness, the running, the shutdowns, the inability to communicate, these behaviors stand out starkly when compared to the emotional maturity she now embodies. He realizes that his fear of vulnerability was the very thing that kept love at a distance. He sees how often he hid behind logic, distraction, or silence to avoid confronting his own heart. Her emotional rebirth becomes a mirror reflecting the parts of himself he has refused to grow. He begins seeing his avoidance patterns with painful clarity. Where he once felt justified in withdrawing, he now understands the consequences of that avoidance. He sees the moments she reached for him and he turned away. He sees the openings she created and the walls he built. He sees how running protected his wounds while wounding the connection. Her certainty exposes his fleeing. Her strength exposes his hesitance. Her alignment exposes his fear. Her transformation becomes the mirror he can no longer escape. Every step she takes into sovereignty reveals where he remains unhealed. Every boundary she sets shines light on where he blurred his own. Every moment she chooses self-love shows him the places he abandoned himself. And the masculine awakens precisely because her growth exposes his stagnation. He realizes that if he does not rise, he will lose not just her, but the version of himself he is meant to become. Her evolution becomes his initiation. Her embodiment becomes his invitation. Her truth becomes his awakening. Through her transformation, he finally sees himself clearly, and that clarity becomes the starting point of his emotional ascent. There is a sacred turning point in the divine feminine's awakening when she reaches the stage of final surrender, not the surrender of defeat or hopelessness, but the surrender that comes from deep spiritual maturity. This surrender is not passive. It is not resignation. It is not giving up on love. Instead, it is the moment she stops trying to control when or how union unfolds. She no longer micromanages the universe, no longer grasps at signs to soothe uncertainty, and no longer tries to predict the masculine's timeline of awakening. She understands that divine timing cannot be forced, accelerated, or manipulated. What is meant for her will not miss her, and what is not meant for her cannot be held through effort alone. This realization softens her spirit and strengthens her soul all at once. As she steps more fully into her higher self, she releases timelines, expectations, and emotional deadlines. She stops asking, "When will he be ready? When will this shift? When will union happen?" Instead, she begins asking, "What is meant for me now? Who am I becoming? How can I align with my highest path?" Her focus moves away from waiting for the masculine to evolve and toward honoring the evolution occurring within her. She recognizes that constantly anticipating his growth kept her stuck in spiritual suspension. So she releases the pressure she unknowingly placed on both herself and him. She surrenders the outcome, not because she is tired, but because she is wise. She understands that the universe weaves in ways she cannot see, and her only task is to remain aligned with truth. In this surrender, a deep trust awakens within her. She trusts that what is aligned will arrive, and what isn't will naturally fall away. There is no need to cling, chase, or force the unfolding of the connection. She realizes that anything she must hold tightly to is not truly hers. Anything that crumbles when she steps into her power was never stable enough to support union. She understands now that love that is meant for her will meet her where she stands, not in her fear, but in her expansion. This trust becomes her spiritual anchor, rooting her in faith rather than anxiety, in presence rather than projection. Surrender becomes empowerment, not defeat. This is the paradox the divine feminine eventually understands. The moment she stops gripping the connection is the moment she steps into her greatest strength. Surrender is not letting go of love, it is letting go of pressure. It is releasing attachment without releasing truth. It is allowing the universe to move through her life without resistance. In surrender, she is not powerless, she is powerful, because she no longer fears the unknown. She walks forward with her heart open and her energy grounded, knowing she does not need guarantees to feel secure. And as she moves ahead, she does so with a profound knowing. The masculine must rise by choice, not by force. She cannot pull him into awakening, cannot carry him into healing, cannot pressure him into readiness. His growth must be self-led, self-inspired, and self-claimed. She no longer attaches her destiny to his timeline. She honors her own path, knowing that if union is part of her soul's design, it will unfold through alignment, not effort. In this final surrender, she becomes the embodiment of divine trust. She becomes the woman who no longer waits, she walks. She no longer begs, she believes. She no longer fears, she flows. And in walking this path, she becomes the feminine who attracts union not through longing, but through living. As we reach the end of this message, remember this: the divine feminine's sudden shift in the second week of December is not a breakdown, it is a breakthrough. It is her soul rising into truth, her heart reclaiming its power, and her energy stepping into alignment with what she truly deserves. This phase may feel confusing, intense, or even unsettling, but it is the doorway to the next chapter of the twin flame journey, one where illusion falls, clarity awakens, and true transformation begins. If this resonated with you, if you felt this shift in your own energy, or if you're experiencing this emotional detachment firsthand, I want to hear from you. Comment below. I choose alignment over illusion. Let this be your affirmation and your declaration. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for walking this path with an open heart. If you want more guidance, more clarity, and more deep spiritual insights on the twin flame journey, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a message meant for your soul. Until next time, stay aligned, stay aware, and trust the shift unfolding within you.